Shabbat Shalom, everyone. We get to break into the next commandment within the 10 Commandments, and that is, you shall not commit adultery. Very concise again, the Lord is. 5 simple words in the English, but yet again, only 2 words in the Hebrew. The Lord has come out, the 2 words fully encompass, lo tinaf, no adultery. And something I can tell you after going through the Word of God, I don't know how many times, Genesis to Revelation, I can tell you this, the Lord is very concerned about this topic. In fact, there's an unusual emphasis that we see that the Lord places on this commandment. I would argue it appears that the Lord's obsessed with this topic. And I say that because Genesis to Revelation, you are confronted with it over and over and over and over again. You look at the warnings God gives in regard to adultery. You look at the judgments that are to be rendered in regard to adultery. You look at the stories that have been preserved regarding adultery. I tell you, this is a really heavy topic. And because it is so weighty, as we get into this, and I'm glad you're sitting down, we're not going to get done with it this week. This is going to take a few weeks to get through. There's some things that I know that we need to hit as a community. There's some things that we need to talk about in this generation. So be patient. With that said, I want to open up today with some commentary by Philo, first century Jewish philosopher, a prolific Bible commentator. He takes up the mantle of the 10 Commandments. In his work known as the Decalogue, he talks about this commandment. And the way he talks about this, you need to hear this, because this is really going to set the tone for the rest of the message, actually, for the rest of the messages, plural. Listen to what he says. He says this, and being about to promulgate the second tablet of the 10 Commandments, which contains the prohibitions of those offenses which are committed against men, he begins with adultery. Listen to this. Looking upon this as the greatest of all violations of the law. Let that sink in. Because Philo is looking at this specific commandment, and he is setting it apart from the rest as being the greatest. Of any sin you can commit against your fellow man, this one ranks at the top. Hopefully he has your attention. Philo knows something. After being an adamant student of the word, he knows something about this commandment. He has seen something, he's derived something out of the word that has led him to this belief. Here's what's fascinating to me. You start peeling back layers of history, you start looking at all the empires and nations and peoples that have existed, pagan empires, secular empires, and you see the same sentiment. This is incredible thought. I want to share with you some commentary. The first one is on Babylon. We read this. The sin of adultery is sometimes referred to as what? The great sin. Angered the gods. Adultery was an abomination to Marduk in Babylon and considered a breach of trust, abandonment, and failure of reciprocation. I mean, this is a wicked pagan kingdom. They serve at the altar of demons. They worship a false god. Marduk was their primary god. And even the pagans have drawn a line in the sand and said, that's too far. Adultery is too far. It's wicked. We look at Hittites. In Hittite law, the husband could kill his wife and paramour if caught in the act and go free. I mean, this is a wicked pagan people that as Israel were to come into the land, they were to cast the Hittites out. And to the Hittites, adultery, too far. They drew a line in the sand. And what they did is they implemented specific laws that would put fear inside society so that they would not cross that line by giving them the ability to take these people out. You know, if you're if you're the person living in Hittite times and your plan is to commit adultery, you would be thinking, well, if I do this and get caught, I'm a dead man. And what would it do? It would push your society back. It would hold back this egregious sin. In Assyrian law, another wicked pagan nation, the husband could effect castration, disfigurement, or death on the guilty parties. Again, we look at the Assyrians, and they were as wicked gets. Adultery's too far. They created laws to make sure people didn't cross the line on that. Going to Greek society, sexual excesses were commonly tolerated in Greek society, even those of married men. No surprise, right? The Greeks were filled with immorality. They're historically known for this. However, adultery with the wife of another man was roundly condemned. Wicked Greeks, adultery too far. We move to the Roman Empire. Musonius Rufus, a conservative Stoic at the time, said, "But of all the sexual relations, those involving adultery are most unlawful." Literally echoing those sentiments of Philo, as Philo is going to the Word of God, placing adultery in a special category. Now we find a Roman philosopher, a Stoic philosopher, which if you're not familiar with the Stoics, that was their own branch of philosophy. They really believed, in many ways, that they parallel, they were not Christian by no means, let me be clear. But a lot of what they believed would parallel what the Bible talks about. They believed in what is called virtue ethics, apatheia. And these virtue ethics would include apatheia, which would mean that they believed that the inner passions, what the Bible would call the lust of the flesh, what the Stoic philosopher called these passions of man, that they were irrational. And true men are called to be rational, those in the know. Those who are men of virtue and of character would go to war against those passions. These are pagan Roman philosophers. And the way they look at adultery, it's the gravest of all sins, the most unlawful. That is really saying something. Let me build on this. In 18 BC, Emperor Augustus turned his attention to social problems in Rome. Now, Augustus was considered the greatest emperor in Rome in the history of Rome. And he was also the first emperor. And as he takes his position of power, which is in 27 BC, he's looking out at this kingdom that he rules, which is massive. And he recognizes there's serious problems in Rome. And what are those problems? Extravagance and adultery were widespread. Among the upper classes, marriage was increasingly infrequent, and married couples who did marry failed to produce offspring. I kid you not, if I didn't know the context of these words, I would say you're describing my society right now, right here in America. Extravagance. We are taken over by extravagance. Adultery is widespread. And guess what? We are starting to see even the people who do get married, they're not producing children. Because that hurts the environment now. Their carbon footprint. Children just don't make sense anymore. I mean, this is bizarre. This is what Augustus is looking at. He's seeing this. Augustus, who hoped thereby to elevate both morals. A pagan king, a pagan emperor, talking about morals. He wanted to elevate morals and the numbers of the upper classes in Rome and to increase the population of native Italians in Italy. So what does Augustus do? What he's looking at this massive problem. Rome's fallen into a state of total depravity. How do we fix this? Listen to this. He enacted laws to encourage marriage and having children, including provisions establishing all adultery as a crime. That's interesting. The Bible already had that figured out. And they call it a crime. The Bible would identify it as sin. And that's a reality. So here he looks out at this. This is how we're going to fix this problem. Let's implement some serious laws. What do these laws look like? We find out. The law against adultery made the offense a crime punishable by exile and confiscation of property. In other words, you get caught committing adultery, and guess what? The state's going to come in. They're going to take everything you own. You will be pillaged. And not just that, now you're going to be excommunicated. See you later. You're going to live in the wilderness as a vagabond. Nothing. This is what Augustus saw. This is how we handle this. But that isn't the worst of it. He took it a step further. Fathers were permitted to kill daughters and their partners in adultery. Husbands could kill their partners under certain circumstances and were required to divorce adulterous wives. This law is no joke. We have a pagan emperor who's recognizing the only way to bring society back, we need to implement this. This is how you create healthy societies, is coming against this sin. And so you want to know how serious Augustus was about this? Listen to this. Augustus himself was obliged to invoke the law against his own daughter Julia and relegated her to the island of Pandateria. Mind-blowing. You want to see how out of control Rome really was? His own daughter, knowing the laws that he had passed, his own daughter got caught. And he imposed the law, excommunicated her. Now, here's the thing. I show you all of this so that you can appreciate that all throughout history, secular and otherwise, the sin of adultery has been something that has been condemned, not just condemned, but really at the top of the order of issues. One of the top concerns, over and over we can see this. Now, does that mean sexual immorality didn't happen? Did that mean adultery didn't happen? No. But even pagan nations had the common sense, we need to implement some things to push back the total depravity and the total fall of our society. Because I'm going to tell you right now, when you see adultery, this sin, the seventh commandment, running amok in your society, you are going to fall. Your society is about to be ripped apart, ripped to shreds. How does our society look right now? I want to share some statistics with you. We read this headline. Infidelity statistics 2022. How much cheating is going on? Well, this is what the article has to say. Nobody wants it to happen to them, and few of us would even imagine that a person we love and care about could stab us in the back so brutally. But cheating happens. In fact, it happens a lot. Infidelity remains the number one reason that married and unmarried relationships end all across the world. According to the General Social Survey, 20% of men cheat as compared to 13% of women. Well, this next statistic gets even worse. According to the LA Intelligence Detective Agency, the numbers are somewhat higher. They write that 30 to 60% of married couples will cheat at least once in the marriage. If this is even close to reality, we're in trouble. We are totally a debased society. We're a society on the brink of collapse. We're a society on the brink of judgment. If this is even close to this number. This next one gets worse. It says this, 74% of men and 68% of women admit they'd cheat if it was guaranteed they'd never get caught. Now, you want your mind really blown. Let's just think about statistics here. There's a lot of variables, a lot of factors we could talk about, but one of the most important is that the people you're interviewing are actually being honest. And they're admitting that they would do this. The mind-blowing thing to me is there's that many people that willingly admitted this. That's the crazy thing. What percentage of people felt that way in their heart, but they didn't disclose it? I wonder how many pastors felt that way, but didn't disclose it. I wonder how many Christians felt that way, but didn't say it. This number is past being troubling because there's already adultery in the heart. It's already there. 69% of marriages break up as a result of an affair being discovered. We're only talking about the ones that are discovered. What does this statistic tell you? Almost 70%. I'm going to tell you what it tells you. You want to destroy marriage? The holy, sacred institution created by God, which He loves? You want to defile that? Just get one of the partners to commit adultery. Do you understand how much the devil is in the details here? Can you appreciate that? This is absolutely demonic. Do you know the first thing that God created after Genesis 1? He gets done with creation. 6 days He labored, and 7th day He rests. Chapter 2 shows you the first thing that He does is He creates marriage. The holy, sacred institution. And since He has done that, the devil has gone after it. And look at his success ratio. You understand the implications, the damage path that this sin causes, the pain it inflicts. I don't want to hold another man weeping uncontrollably because his spouse committed adultery. I don't want to have to pray with another woman who's had her heart ripped out because her husband committed adultery. I can't tell you how many times I've had to do this. You know, these statistics only confirm what I already know. The latest statistics show that 56% of men and 34% of women who commit infidelity rate their marriages as happy or very happy. This makes the reason people cheat a little harder to dissect and comprehend. One of the most disturbing statements in this entire discussion. How do you wrap your head around? This isn't a situation where, oh, you know what, you have a woman who's emotionally being abused at home by her husband or physically abused by her husband. That is not the issue. Not that that doesn't happen. We have marriage people who willingly say, who have been asked, why do you cheat? Was your marriage that bad? No, it wasn't bad. It was okay. Actually, I was happy. What is going on here? Something is going on when people have what most people would look at, they have a good marriage. And yet somebody's being ripped out, being taken to the cleaners through deception so that the enemy can wreak havoc on what God created. It's absolutely demonic. Listen to this. 2 to 3% of all children are due to infidelity. And shockingly, most of these children are unknowingly raised by men who are not their biological fathers. Can I share something with you? I have a friend who is this statistic, who I grew up with, and his mom and dad, nice people. It was wonderful. We were in our teens. He thinks his dad is his dad. I think his dad is his dad. It's been since birth. I mean, he held him as a baby. He walked him in his first steps. He helped him when he had health issues. His dad was there the entire time, only to find out later on, oh, that's not your son. That was the product of an affair. You think that affected my friend emotionally? Tore him up. In fact, I will argue it sent him down a path that was unimaginable. A total path of destruction. And what do you think it did to his dad, who thought this was his son his entire life? Only to find out, no, your wife cheated on you, and that's not your son. You want to talk about needing counseling for the rest of your life? That'll do it. And Satan is laughing. He loves it. This is his kingdom. This is his fruit of his kingdom. This is what builds his kingdom. This vile kind of activity. I could go on and on. I could quote to you numbers and statistics all day long, none of which are encouraging, all of which tell you we're in trouble. You know we're in trouble when we have websites that are dedicated for you literally going out to commit adultery against your spouse. Ashley Madison, I think most of you have heard this. What a tagline. Life is short, have an affair. Life is short, just have an affair. Oh, isn't that wonderful? On this website, right on the front page, you can scroll down and you can see they shared their story. It's just a quick passage. It's a quick paragraph. I want to share it with you. Check this out. As a place free of judgment, Ashley Madison revolves around the idea that consenting adults should be able to do whatever they want in private. This is the mentality. You have the right. So here you are, Satan's alluring you, hissing in your ear, getting you just to consider about this. Then all of a sudden you find yourself on the Ashley Madison website, and you come down and look at their story, and now the hook is set. They've convinced you, you have the right to this. This is your right to privacy. You got to be kidding me. Free of judgment. I promise you, you will not be free of judgment. I promise you. The Word of God is spoken on this matter. I want to share a page. I want to share some info that I took off some time ago from the UN website that just so happens to work perfectly for today. And let me be clear. If you want to understand where the collective, and I emphasize that term collective, if you want to understand where the term or where the collective society is going, you want to pay attention to the UN. The UN is at the helm. You want to pay attention to what they're doing. You want to pay attention to what they're saying. Listen to this statement. A joint statement by the United Nations Working Group on Discrimination Against Women in Law and Practice. Listen to this. Adultery as a criminal offense violates women's human rights. This is how the UN takes the position that trying to criminalize something we've seen all throughout history, even amongst pagans who worship demons, said adultery is too far. The UN has come on the scene and said, no, this is actually a protected right. And then it goes on and says this. It says, almost 2 decades ago, international human rights jurisprudence established that criminalization of sexual relations between consenting adults, that means male and female, we're not just talking about women, is a violation of their right to privacy and infringement of Article 17 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. This is the UN's take, that you cannot criminalize this. This is the mouthpiece of the collectivists. This is the mouthpiece of where the entire world is being unified. In the United Nations, and they are determining that it is your right. It's your right to privacy. We cannot criminalize that. That sounds very familiar because this is what we just read on the Ashley Madison website. Consenting adults should be able to do whatever they want in private. It should be protected. It's interesting that Ashley Madison is merely echoing what the UN is proclaiming. And you want to pay attention to that because this is the spirit. It's a spirit. It's a spirit of Antichrist. It's a spirit of Antichrist that is taking over the world. It is no joke. This topic that we're delving into, as serious as it gets, especially what we see happening in the world right now. I want to take you to the Gospel of Mark. We're going to get into some scripture. We're going to look at a particular story that really pertains to our subject. And there's a couple points here that are very strong that we want to walk away with. Gospel of Mark says this, chapter 6, verse 14. Now King Herod heard Yeshua, for his name had become well known. Now before we continue in looking at the rest of the story, I want to clarify some things in regard to the characters. Number one, who is this King Herod? This is not Herod the Great. This is Herod Antipas, okay? And this is going to be important for you to understand. And just to help your perspective and the characters of the story that we're going to delve into here, it's always helpful to have a visual. So I'm going to put up a graph. Herod the Great. We start with Herod the Great. He was the Herod that existed, was in power over all Judea when Yeshua was born. This is the man who called himself the King of the Jews. Can't make that up. So you can see why, to his surprise, when 3 wise men come from the east and ask him, where is he who's been born king of the Jews? Herod had a problem with that. He was the king of the Jews. His background of his family, he was an Edomian, meaning he was an Edomite. He came from a heritage of Edomites, but it gets more interesting. He was from heritage that converted to Judaism. Herod was raised as a Jew. Certainly, we would all debate he was not a good practicing Jew, but he was raised as a Jew. Now, I'm going to show you a small part of his family tree here. He married a woman known as Mariamne, and she was actually the daughter of a high priest, Shimon. And out of this marriage came a son. His name is Herod Philip. Very important, because Herod Philip, who, even today, or even in the Bible, we talk about Caesarea Philippi, it's named after him. He married a woman known as Herodias. Now, Herod, being an overachiever that he is, married another woman. And that woman was known as Malthus. And I want to be clear, Herod had more than 2 wives. He had 10 wives. He fancied himself, I think, someone like Solomon. But Malthus was a Samaritan. And out of that marriage came Herod Antipas. And the very premise of our story is that this marriage began to have a problem because Herodias is going to leave Philip and she's going to marry Antipas, Philip's brother. This is what she's going to do. And so this visual hopefully will help you. Now that said, let's go back to our story. Now King Herod, meaning Antipas, heard of Yeshua, for his name had become well known, and he said, John the Baptist is risen from the dead, and therefore these powers are at work in him. Now, if you just step back and think about that statement, it's bizarre. If we didn't know the rest of the story, it's absolutely bizarre. Apparently, Antipas caught wind of what Yeshua was doing, whether it was his servants or some other way. The word got back to him that Yeshua is healing the sick, he's raising the dead, the blind see, the deaf hear. I mean, demons are coming out of people. Nobody's ever heard of such a thing in all Israel, of a guy doing this kind of wonders. But the bizarre thing is Herod's conclusion to hearing this is John the Baptist raised from the dead. Why? Why would Herod come to that conclusion? Well, see, here's the thing. If you know the rest of the story, Herod actually put him in the grave. Herod is responsible for taking out John the Baptist. And by these words, you can tell the fact that he did that, he was convicted, he was riddled with guilt, he was terrified, he has night terrors. This is what's keeping him up. So the moment he hears about some great power, it's John. He's come back to haunt me. My sins are coming back to haunt me. Now, as we continue, the author, Mark, or who we call Mark, he's going to take us back in time so that we can go back to the beginning of, there's a specific order of events that take place here. In verse 17, we read, For Herod himself had sent and laid hold of John and bound him in prison. Listen to this. For the sake of Herodias, his brother's, Philip's wife, for he had married her. We just got a significant bit of information that we need to process right now to truly understand the entire story. And that is this. Why Herod first put John into prison? It wasn't Herod. In other words, of his own accord. He was influenced by his wife, Herodias. Herodias is behind this. She hates John. She loathes him. Why? Well, we read this. In verse 18, because John had said to Herod, it is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife. So here's the thing. John comes on the scene. He calls Herod out. You have sinned against God. You have broken his law. Specifically, what law? Lo tinaf, the 7th commandment, you shall not commit adultery. And the thing I love about John is he's not concerned about whether or not he sounds politically correct. He's not concerned whether or not he is going to offend somebody by speaking the truth. He's not a respecter of persons. You can't bribe him. You can't pay him off. John's only concern was to speak the truth of God. That's all he cared about. His ministry was built on the premise to turn the hearts of the people back to their God. That's the whole purpose of his ministry. Now, as a side note, I want to take you to the writings of Josephus. I want to break in here. We'll continue in the story. But Josephus adds to this story a couple details that I think are important for us to have that really build upon this. And Josephus says this: "But Herodias, their sister, was married to Herod Philip, the son of Herod the Great, who was born of Mariamne, the daughter of Shimon the high priest, who had a daughter, Salome." Now, this is interesting because the Gospels actually don't record the name of the daughter of Herodias. The daughter is Salome. But then it adds this, and this detail is very important: "After whose birth Herodias took upon herself to confound the laws of our country." Josephus is saying she desecrated the law of God. She has desecrated the Torah. She desecrated the Decalogue. How? Because she went out, as it says here, to divorce herself from her husband while he was alive and was married to Herod Antipas. And so we get some backstory here that it was after the birth of Salome, and it doesn't say whether it's 6 months, it could have been a year, it could have been 2 years, but after the birth of Salome, Herodias picked up her stuff and went to Herod Antipas to marry him. She divorced Philip so that she could marry him. Antipas moved to divorce the daughter of King Herodias. And that caused quite a stir because they wanted to come. It was a regular Ashley Madison moment. It really was. I mean, what is going on here is incredible. And so with that, let's go back. Verse 18. "Because John had said to Herod, 'It is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife.'" He's laying down the law. "Therefore, Herodias held it against him and wanted to kill him." Herodias wants John taken out. She wants this voice of reason, this voice of clarity, this voice of truth. Put this voice to death. And what's interesting, it's not even John the Baptist's voice. It's the voice of the living God. It's the commandment of the living God. Herodias hates the voice of God. She hates God. Her response declares it. And I think of this response, and I can't help but think about Yeshua's words when he says, "For everyone practicing evil hates the light and does not come to the light, lest his deeds should be exposed." She is the essence of evil. She is the essence of someone dwelling in darkness who hates the light. And what does it say in Proverbs 6? The commandment is a lamp. The seventh commandment. That includes the seventh commandment, lo tinaf. It is a lamp and the law is a light. What John the Baptist brought to this situation was light. And the darkness hates it. Because she was enveloped in sin. She wanted to continue in sin, so she's offended by the light. Yeshua adds this: "For the world cannot hate you, but it hates me, because I testify of it that its works are evil." You want a little deeper perspective of this situation? Herodias' loathing, burning hatred for John the Baptist, in all reality, she hated Yeshua. This is what I'm saying. She hated the word of God. She hates him. You know, I have a saying. You want to make friends with the world? Tell them what they want to hear. You want to make friends of God? Tell them the truth. That's the reality. Now, as we look at verse 19 here, "Therefore Herodias held it against him and wanted to kill him." There's a little bit more here that is added. "But she could not." She couldn't do it. Why? Well, we learn this. "For Herod feared John, knowing He was a just and holy man, and he protected him. And when he heard him, he did many things and heard him gladly. It's an amazing thing. And so you can see, and probably in Herod Antipas's mind, the fact that he moved to throw him in prison, he was thinking he was splitting the difference. He probably thought he was being quite crafty, because on one hand, he's appeasing his wife, dealing with John, making her think, well, I'm your husband, and I'm going to do something for you. I know this is in your heart. You hate him. You loathe him. So I'll throw him in prison. At the same time, Antipas is probably thinking, yet I'm protecting him by putting him in prison. Even though you're falsely accusing John, you're putting him in prison wrongly. That certainly doesn't justify it. But you can see from Antipas's position how he would justify what he'd done as wisdom. Now moving on. Verse 21. Then an opportune day came when Herod on his birthday gave a feast for his nobles, the high officers, and the chief men of Galilee. And so what we're looking at here is this is not just any old gathering. This is a very significant gathering. This is a prestigious affair. The creme de la creme are coming to this gathering, this gala, if you will. Verse 22. And when Herodias' daughter herself came in and danced, and listen to this, pleased Herod. This dance pleased him. It must have been hypnotic. It must have been something very impressive, because it didn't just please Herod, but we learn, and those who sat with him. And this is very important, because what follows directly pertains to what we are reading right now. The fact that not just Herod, but his very special guest, the creme de la creme, they were impressed. They were in awe. They pleased the crowd. And so how does Herod respond? He says to the girl, ask me whatever you want, and I will give it to you. Herod takes the celebration to a whole nother level. And you better believe these words would have caught the attention of every single guest at the party. To make an offer like this is so significant, especially in the historical context. So significant, it would have garnered the attention of every single person sitting there. You'd have probably heard a pin drop, him making this statement. But as we continue, the statement gets stronger. In verse 23, he also what? He swore to her, whatever you ask me, I will give you up to half my kingdom. Oh my. Now this is really something, in our family devotions, we just got done reading the book of Esther. And you will notice that this very statement is said multiple times by King Ahasuerus to Esther. What do you ask, Esther, Queen Esther? Whatever it is, I will give you up to half of my kingdom. That's a very significant statement. It's the strongest statement that a king could make. And so do you feel the weight of this? Do you feel what he has just brought to the table? And this is why, I kid you not, you could probably hear a pin drop in that room, knowing what he has just said and swore to her. Verse 24. So she went out and said to her mother, what shall I ask? And she said, the head of John the Baptist. Now you think about this situation. Whatever you want, up to half of my kingdom. You can have all the riches you could imagine. Do you want a monument made in your name so that all the people of the land of Galilee and Perea, which King Herod Antipas ruled over, so that they could acknowledge you, so that you can be glorified? Or do you want land? Do you want an extravagant house? Anything is at their disposal. Herodias doesn't blink. She comes back. All she wants, her ultimate desire, is to destroy John, to take him out. She loathes him that much. Man, I'm going to tell you, as I look at Herodias, she is nothing more than Jezebel. Filled with the spirit of Jezebel. What do we know about Jezebel? She stirred up her husband, Ahab, to do more evil than any king before him. This is what she did. What else did she do? Well, you can't even make this stuff up. She killed the prophets. What is Herodias moving to do? To kill the prophets of God. And if that weren't enough, then you have Yeshua. literally associating directly the name Jezebel, as he's speaking to the church at Thyatira, with sexual immorality. The very thing that Herodias is guilty of. Engaging in sexual immorality, in adultery. She is Jezebel. It is a Jezebel spirit that leads the charge in adultery. Moving on to verse 25. Immediately she came in with haste to the king and asked, saying, I want you to give me at once the head of John the Baptist on a platter. And the king was exceedingly sorry, yet because of the oaths and, look at this, because of those who sat with him, it mattered to him. These people that he was surrounded, the creme de la creme, their acceptance was that important to him. More important than walking in righteousness. He did not want to refuse her. And so what happens? Immediately the king sent an executioner and commanded his head to be brought. And he went and beheaded him in prison, brought his head on a platter and gave it to the girl, and the girl gave it to her mother. Why did this happen? This entire crescendo where John, the prophet, John the Baptist, ends up being executed. Why? He actually proclaimed that adultery, the seventh commandment, was a sin. Process that for a second. And as you're processing, consider the following. Yeshua says in Matthew 11 that among those born among women, there's not a greater that has ever arisen than John the Baptist. We are talking about, I don't even know how to wrap my head around that because I'm looking at some of the greatest of the greats, whether you're talking about Noah, Abraham, who God made covenant with, who would be as the stars of the sky, would be continually blessed, that anyone that would believe in Yeshua would actually be called a son of Abraham. We're told John is greater. Isaac, Jacob, Elijah, Moses. And then I try to process these words that Yeshua says, among those born among women, no one greater. And you know what? It makes perfect sense because guess what? Who was the one to come and herald? Who was chosen to herald the light of the world? It was John. He had to be the greatest, and yet John is not even worthy to unloose the sandal strap of our King. That's an amazing thing. This guy, the greatest man ever born among women outside of Yeshua, was put to death because he stood against adultery. That is something incredible that I think we need to process, especially in our generation. Isaiah 59, verse 14, we read, justice is turned back, and righteousness stands afar off. This is a generation that is broken, that is totally given over to sin. And look at this. Truth is fallen in the street, and equity cannot enter. This is the moment the Antichrist comes in and starts destroying the truth of God. It doesn't allow the truth of God to go forth in society. And then we read this. So truth fails. And he who departs from evil makes himself prey. If you do not consent and to go along with society and their debauchery and their depravity, you are going to make yourself prey, and you may find yourself very soon with your head on a platter. If you're going to hold the line. Are you going to be bold? Are you going to hold the line like John the Baptist? And I'm going to tell you this. John the Baptist heralds the coming of the Messiah. The days that John the Baptist live in, do you know what they're called? An evil, not making this up, an adulterous generation. An evil and adulterous generation. This was the environment of society with the coming of the Messiah. It will be that way again. And I will tell you right now, it already is. That's how close we are to the coming of Yeshua. He is coming soon. You better get ready. You trim your lamps. Have your staff in your hand, your belt on your waist. Habakkuk says, therefore, the law is powerless. Not that, he's not saying the Torah is powerless in and of itself. The law is powerless, and justice never goes forth. In other words, the law is being rendered powerless because none of us are giving ourselves over to it. It's not guiding us. You have a generation, a society that will not listen to to his commandments. And it really blows your mind when this is coming to when you start to see pastors and teachers telling you, you don't need the law. We're in trouble. We are in trouble. For the wicked surround the righteous, therefore perverse judgment proceeds. Do not think that if you're living in the days of Elijah, the days of John the Baptist, days that is an evil and adulterous generation, do not expect when you step up for righteousness that you'll be given fair judgment. I want to lay this out because Scripture warns us. Don't think you're going to be treated fairly. Don't expect, you know what, we got to trust the court system. It's going to make a good judgment. It's not going to. Christians all over, not just this country, but the world, are going to be falsely accused because society does not want to hear what you have to say. Society hates the law of God. Get ready. You better be resolved like John the Baptist, especially in regard to this commandment. Daniel 8:12, because of transgression, an army was given over to the horn, the Antichrist, to oppose the daily sacrifices. And what does he do? He cast truth to the ground. He did all this and prospered. This is, it's interesting because we're talking about the Antichrist. This is a prophecy of Antiochus Epiphanes. Here we're coming up into Hanukkah. And the whole premise of that, Antiochus Epiphanes went out to destroy Torah. He actually made them burn their copies of the law. It was an offense to him. And yet there was a group that stood up for righteousness, that wouldn't bend the knee, that wouldn't compromise, the Maccabees. As we think about this and as we get into Hanukkah, this is where we need to be, amen? All right.